Well, welcome everybody to Biscuit School here in our virtual community. And I'm Karen DeBoard, and my husband and I have a bed and breakfast here. It's called Bedford Landings. It's no guests here right now, unfortunately. And so we decided we would be involved in the biscuit school, in the virtual community to teach biscuit making. And so I just want to walk you right in our front door. And Jack's in the kitchen, and we have been missing cooking for people, and so we just thought this would be a good opportunity to go ahead and use up some of those ingredients we have on hand ready to use for today. And so this is the coming in the front door, and we live here, so all the rooms are upstairs, and Jack is here. Look at that. In the kitchen. And so I'm gonna get Jack to say a few words to you, and then I'm gonna set my phone down so we
Welcome to biscuit making class. We've been making biscuits here ever since we opened the B&B, and I had actually gone to a biscuit making school to learn how to make them. I'd tried for years to make good biscuits and couldn't make them as good as I could get out of a can. But I finally went to a class and learned about 6 things I was doing wrong making biscuits. So I'll show you the correct way to make them today.
Okay, so we're gonna just go over here. I know that Heather has the recipe. She's gonna put up just for a moment while we get this settled in on Jack's utensils.
Yeah, there's what?
Okay, she's put the recipe up on the screen share until we get this set. Okay, so I think we're set, Heather. So Jack, you can go ahead and talk, and she's got the biscuit recipe on the screen.
Okay. You don't need a lot in the way of special utensils to make biscuits. You need a good biscuit cutter, and it's something like, I don't know if
okay, so now you can show Jack again. He's going to show a few things.
Okay, you need a biscuit, what?
Now.
Okay, you need a biscuit cutter that has sharp edges. This one is made of metal and cuts a nice, clean biscuit. You need a pastry blender, which is this piece right here. You don't have to have that. You can use a fork if you want to blend the pastry together. And then you need the usual measuring spoons and measuring cups. But one other thing that's handy to have is an air cell baking sheet. This type of a baking sheet, you can buy these at Kroger's. It has air cells built into it, so it tends to cook more evenly. It doesn't burn the bottom of the biscuit while the rest of it's baking. And so that's really useful to have. You don't have to have it. You can use any kind of a baking sheet, but it's just easier to burn the biscuits if you use a regular baking sheet. Okay, so you've got the recipe, or you've seen the recipe now. Let me talk a little bit about flour. As I said, I learned about 6 things that I was doing wrong making biscuits, and one of the first things that they told me was you've got to use proper Southern flour. Everybody hears about good Southern biscuits. Notice you don't ever hear anybody talk about the great biscuits of Kansas. It's because you need crappy flour to make good biscuits. Not crappy, but low quality flour. Southern flour is typically made from winter wheat, and it's very low gluten. So it doesn't hold together terribly well, which makes for a nice flaky biscuit. The Midwestern flour, like Pillsbury or Gold Medal, has a lot of gluten in it. And if you try to make biscuits out of that, you're going to make hockey pucks. So that's the primary tip that I got from the cooking class, was use good Southern flour. And what I use is Martha White or Southern Biscuit or White Lily. All 3 of those are available at Food Line. Kroger is a Midwestern company. Kroger typically does not carry any of these brands of flour. So you may have to go to Food Line to get decent biscuit flour.
How about self-rising flour? Can we use that?
No, don't use self-rising. Notice these are both all-purpose flours. The thing is, with self-rising flour, it's just all-purpose flour that has baking powder and baking soda added to it, but you don't know how much they put in. The recipes that I use typically call for all-purpose flour, and then you add whatever baking soda and baking powder is required, and that way you know exactly what you've got in it. Okay, so to get started with the biscuits, this recipe calls for 3 cups of flour. So pour that into the measuring cup. It's about 3 cups. And then it calls for a heaping tablespoon of baking powder. Oh, and that's another tip they gave me. Use Rumford baking powder. Comes in the red can here. It doesn't have any aluminum in it. Most baking powders have aluminum phosphate in the baking powder, and it gives kind of a bitter taste to the food. Rumford's the only one I know of that doesn't put that in there. So a heaping tablespoon of that.
Tell them about the expiration date on baking.
Yeah, that's another mistake I was making when I was trying to make biscuits. I always thought that a can of baking powder was a lifetime supply. But as it turns out, baking powder has an expiration date, and it's fairly short. It's usually about 6 months. It's on the bottom of the can. Like this one says, it's best used by December of 2021. So it's a little over a year. This is a fairly new can. But when I took that class in 2009, and when I got home, I looked at the can of baking powder I had. It had expired in 2000. So that was one reason I wasn't making very good biscuits. Okay, then we put in a ½ teaspoon of baking soda. And then a teaspoon of salt.
What kind of salt?
Doesn't matter whether it's sea salt or, I mean, salt is salt. It's sodium chloride. And the only difference between sea salt and Morton iodized salt is that the sea salt is typically a little bit larger grains. And that's what makes it kind of have a pop of flavor if you put sea salt on food as seasoning. But when you're cooking with it, it all gets mixed together. It doesn't really matter.
What do you call these 3? You got these 3 ingredients are really important in the cooking world.
That's the holy trinity of baking: the baking powder, baking soda, and salt. That's just about everything that we bake has those in it. And then this also has a teaspoon of sugar, a heaping teaspoon. Okay, that's all the dry ingredients. So then you take your pastry blender and just stir that up, get it well mixed. And we'll set that aside and start working on the shortening. Now, I use a mixture of Crisco vegetable shortening and butter. I like the flavor of butter in a biscuit. And so, but if you use all butter, no Crisco, butter has water in it, and it changes the texture of the biscuit and makes it a little mushy. So I put 4 tablespoons of butter and 10 tablespoons of Crisco.
Now, someone said they didn't have Crisco on hand. That's online. I told them just to get their butter for today.
You can use butter, but bear in mind that it's gonna be, butter has water in it. So you might want to cut back on the amount of buttermilk that you put in, because otherwise it's gonna be too wet.
So Jack's going over to the refrigerator and getting out of the freezer the Crisco. These are the sticks, not the can.
I use the Crisco baking sticks just because it's easier to handle. I keep it in the freezer because you want the shortening to be very cold. So I'm going to have 10 tablespoons of this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Put a mark right there and cut it. And the shortening you want to cut into roughly ½ cubes. Get this all unwrapped. sure don't have any paper in the shortening. That's generally not good in the biscuit. Okay. So you just cut the shortening into 1/2-inch cubes. And they don't have to be terribly uniform. You want them into chunks that you can work with the pastry blender. All right, so after I get the Crisco cut into chunks, then I'll use butter. I use salted butter. I just think it tastes better. French chefs never use salted butter, but French chefs don't make Southern biscuits. You use 1/2 a stick.
Is there a reason why you keep the Crisco frozen?
Yes, you want to keep the shortening as cold as possible, because when you start cutting it in, you'll see when I cut it into the flour, you want it to stay in chunks or stay in little clumps of shortening. And if it gets too warm, it just kind of melts and flows together. So do the same thing with the butter. Cut it into about 1/2-inch chunks. Okay. Save the other 1/2 of a stick of butter. You'll use that later. Then, now this is important. If you're making biscuits for a breakfast or something and you need to have the breakfast ready at a certain time, for example, at the B&B, we always serve right at 8 o'clock. So once you have the dry ingredients mixed, you have your shortening cut and ready to cut into the flour. If you're not going to get the biscuits into the oven within about 15 minutes, put the shortening back in the freezer and keep it cold until you're ready, because once you start mixing that, you've got about 15 minutes to get the biscuits into the oven, or else the shortening will melt and run and just doesn't make a very flaky biscuit. So I'm going to assume that we're going to be in the oven in 15 minutes, and I'll go ahead and scrape all this stuff into the dry ingredients. And then using the pastry blender, we'll just kind of mash this stuff up. What you're doing when you're cutting in the shortening is you're making little clumps of a tiny little clump of shortening that's completely coated with flour. And the idea behind this is you want to get these clumps down small enough that they're uniformly distributed throughout the dough. And then when you cook the biscuit, that shortening will melt and it'll make a little pocket of steam. It helps the biscuit to be flaky. So you want to keep cutting it in with the pastry blender until it has the consistency of kind of coarse cornmeal. You don't want any big clumps like you see these great big clumps of shortening that I've got here. You want to keep working it until none of the clumps are any bigger than, say, a pea.
And here we thought we just would throw them together and throw them in the oven, but no, it's got some science to it.
Yeah, food actually has a lot of science behind it, and most of which I don't know. But I know what works and what doesn't work through bitter experience. My grandmother always said biscuits had to be made with love, and I guess this is where the love part comes in, because this is the only hard work in making a biscuit is cutting in the shortening, and it takes several minutes, and it's tiring.
So these were your grandma's measuring spoons?
Yep, those are at least 60 or 70 years old.
That Jack won't use our new ones. He has to use grandma's. I don't know if you saw the biscuit cutter. This is, I'm sure he'll talk about this. That's what he's going to use to cut the biscuits with.
Okay, we're just about getting there with the dough.
Let me see if I can get a good picture of what he's got going in there.
Okay, can you see the consistency? Even looking here on the pastry blender, none of these, there's a few big clumps of shortening, but most of it is pretty small, and you want to make sure it's evenly distributed. All right, so once we get it to this stage, then I'll take a spatula and just kind of make a well in the middle of the dry mixture. And we'll go ahead and get ready to roll out the biscuits here. So I'm gonna take some bench flour and just spread it on the countertop here. This is the granite countertop, and it makes it really nice for working the biscuits.
I want to cut to Margaret's kitchen and see what she's doing. Are you making biscuits, Margaret?
Yeah, I thought this was a cook-along. I'm trying.
Are you? Are you staying up with us?
Well, I'm catching up.
Okay.
So the last ingredient then is buttermilk. And the buttermilk has a couple of functions in the biscuits. Its primary function is buttermilk is acidic. And the acid in the buttermilk reacts with the baking soda in the baking soda and in the baking powder, and it creates carbon dioxide. And so that helps the biscuits to rise. And then the baking powder has cornstarch in it as well, and that makes it rise once it gets hot in the oven. That's why sometimes you'll hear baking powder being described as double acting. It's because the first action comes as soon as the buttermilk hits it, and the second action comes when you bake it.
How much buttermilk are we using?
We're using 1.5 cups, and it's important to use, fresh buttermilk. So this is still legal. It's April 8th.
What?
And the buttermilk also you want to keep cold. So don't pour that first and then leave it sitting out.
All right, so cold buttermilk.
All right, so now we pour the buttermilk into the mix, and I always save I'll pour all of it in there, because sometimes, the humidity varies, and if it's a really humid day, you don't need as much buttermilk. If it's a really dry day, you need a little bit more. So, and that's something that just comes with experience, knowing, whether you need to add more or not. So then you stir the stuff up until it begins to come together and changes from a powder to a dough. Yes, I've got a little bit more powder in there. I'm going to add just a touch more buttermilk.
Hold the bowl over so we can see it.
Yeah, so once you get it all mixed up with the buttermilk, there shouldn't be any dry powder. It should all pretty well hang together. And you should be able to just dump the whole lot out at once.
Drop some.
Yeah. Throw that back in there. Okay. So now it's all come together, and I'll just dump it out onto my floured surface here.
The sous chef will take your bowl.
Yeah. Okay, get some flour on your hands and just kind of bring all this stuff together into a ball. Now, even though this is southern flour and it's low gluten, it still has gluten in it. And it's important that you not overwork it, because if you if you knead it a lot like you would making a loaf of bread, it's not going to be flaky. And another trick to make a flakier biscuit, once you have it rolled out like this or patted out, then sprinkle a little flour on it and then fold it over, pack it back together. Mash it down again. I don't have the recipe in front of me. I think that recipe says to do this 6 times. I usually only really do it about 4 times. So sprinkle some flour on it, spread that around, fold it back over. Putting that flour in there makes it easier to come apart as layers when you're eating the biscuit, so it makes it automatically flaky. You can use a rolling pin to do this. I prefer to just pat it out. A little bit more flour.
It's a good little workout.
Fold it over.
I could call this yoga biscuit making.
I don't know if that's 3 or 4 times that I've done it, but that's enough. Anyway, I can tell by the way it's kind of springing back when I press on it. When it starts springing back, that means you've really activated the gluten, and if you don't want it to get any tougher. Okay, now we use the biscuit cutter, and another tip that I learned in the biscuit class was that you want a very sharp biscuit cutter. You want to dip it in the flour, and then you push it straight down and don't twist. If you use, say, a water glass to cut the biscuits, it's got a rounded edge, and it tends to smear the it tends to smear the sides of the biscuit and keeps it from being flaky. Also, if you twist it as you're cutting the biscuit, that smears the biscuit and keeps it from being flaky.
So those are key concepts, on cutting biscuits. Yep. Straight down.
Push straight down. Dip it in flour each time. Sometimes it hangs in the biscuit cutter, sometimes it doesn't. If it hangs in it, just push it out.
Hey, Adam, I'm glad you showed up today. I'm trying to get Adam to do a craft cocktail class and get to join in for that.
Yeah, would anybody be interested in drinking online with us?
We'll send our biscuits over.
Yeah, y'all make the biscuits and send them over, and then I would do a cocktail class at night.
Yeah, I think that you could also talk about like the bourbon and stuff that you like to be drinking. I know that Jack, you're a bourbon fan, aren't you?
No, I'm Scotch.
Yeah, Jack's a Scotch guy.
Okay, so once you've cut all the biscuits out of the dough that you can, then pick the dough up, mash it back together, and then flatten it out again. Try to keep the same thickness and cut a few more biscuits out of that.
See our other cute little biscuit cutters? We got all these different sizes. How many does this make?
Well, it depends on how thick you make them. Typically, with that biggest biscuit cutter, it'll make about a dozen. So that's 10 right there. Looks like I'm going to get 11, and that's about it. That's not going to be enough for another biscuit. Usually whatever's left over, I'll just roll up and make a snake out of it like you used to when you were playing with Play-Doh when you were a kid. And I might be able to get one more biscuit out of that.
Even dozen. It'll be a little snake today.
Yeah. All right. So then, and I should have mentioned before starting, I hope, Margaret, you we're smart enough to do this. You got to get the oven preheated to 450 degrees. And so you go ahead and put them in the oven and set the timer for about 7 minutes, 7 or 8 minutes. And at the end of that time, you'll pull them out and rotate the baking sheet. Meanwhile, I told you you had a use for this other half of the stick of butter. Put it in a microwave safe dish. Put it in the microwave for about 44 seconds. And we'll use that melted butter then to brush over the tops of the biscuits when they come out of the oven.
What do we do with this big mess?
That's for the sous chef. Yeah.
Oh, the sous chef has to do that, huh?
What happens when you don't have a sous chef that will help you and talks about too much?
Well, I'll show you a trick that I learned at the cooking school. They had this set up in their kitchen. And when we designed and built this house, I made sure we had these, let Karen show you, in the granite countertop on the island, we put a dough hole.
Mm.
And at cooking school, they used what's called a pastry knife, which they sold in the store there for $12 a piece. I found it was almost identical to a drywall knife that you can buy at Home Depot for $3. And once you're done, you can just use the drywall knife to scrape all the mess on the countertop and scrape it into the dough hole.
That's a fabulous idea.
Mm-hmm.
And we just keep a small child underneath there, and that's the only sustenance he gets. It really does make cleanup easy.
Yeah, we have a Corona-free cabinet.
Okay, so we got the biscuits in the oven, and
Do you all need to revisit the recipe or look at that for any reference? If you have any questions as well.
Yeah.
She's got the recipe on there. All right, so now we're just going to imagine
we've had a time warp here.
that 15 minutes has gone by. And okay, Heather, we're ready. Look at that.
Yep, amazing how fast that 15 minutes went. But yeah, so you bake the biscuits about 15 minutes, and then as soon as you pull them out, use a basting brush with the melted butter that we just did in the microwave and brush butter over the tops of all the biscuits. And it soaks in and gives that wonderful buttery flavor. As I say, this is not health food. It's healthy food because everything's made from scratch, but you know, you're gonna gain some weight if you eat a lot of these biscuits.
And this is about what time our guests come down, and we put them hot on the plate.
Yep. Yeah, we've learned over the years to time it to have the biscuits coming out of the oven as the guests are coming down for breakfast. And that way they're hot and steamy and fresh.
So start to finish, if you were planning a specific time to have them ready, how long should you plan?
I figure on about 40 minutes.
40 minutes? Okay.
Yeah, it takes 15 minutes to bake them. It takes a couple of minutes to brush them with butter. And the rest of the time is spent just preparing the ingredients. Okay, so here's the end result. Let's see if you can you see that? So it's just a nice flaky biscuit and it's delicious.
Are you gonna eat it?
Sure.
I'll gain 10 pounds for that. It's a small price to pay.
Now, I think Bojangles makes the best tasting biscuits I've ever eaten, but I don't eat there very often once I found out how they make their biscuits.
You're chewing with food in your
I
mouth?
know.
I know. Should I get you some orange juice or something? You got some water here somewhere. They're actually pretty moist. They're not choke material, but you know, biscuits.
Bojangles makes sandwich biscuits. They have to hold together to make a sandwich, and these will crumble if you try to do much of a sandwich with them. I mean, they'll work for a piece of country ham or a piece of bacon or something, but put a whole chicken fillet on there like Bojangles does, these are going to fall apart. The way Bojangles makes theirs, where they don't fall apart, is for shortening. They use some long chain polymers. It's essentially plastic, and it holds together almost like fiberglass in the biscuit dough, and keeps it from coming apart while you're eating the sandwich. Not particularly good for you. So I love their biscuits, but I try not to eat them very often.
The one thing that I like about Bojangles biscuits is that slightly salty, crusty thing that they have going on the outside.
Yeah, and they do the same thing that I was just doing with these. They baste them with butter after they come out of the oven, and that's where you get that saltiness, because using salted butter, it'll add a little salt flavor to it. I don't take this one. I'm eating this.
Thank you, Jack. That was very informative. I learned a lot. And I like to bake. I do mostly sweet baking. Biscuits is something I've never, ever attempted. But just like with cakes and cookies and stuff, the flour that you use is important. And so
Yeah,
I really like the tips.
I learned something today just by accident, and that is that I don't have any Pillsbury flour or any gold medal flour here because we make so much biscuits. But I've had a hard time making pie crust that will hold together when you roll them out. My pie crusts tend to break apart. And so I think I need to get some Pillsbury flour on hand just for doing pie crusts.
Hot pads are behind you. Okay, so these are the actual biscuits that we were making earlier, as opposed to the ones that we made about 30 minutes ago. Yeah, so Jack was just rotating the pan. He thinks that just
helps them cook more evenly. So I put them in there for 7 minutes, and then when the timer went off, rotated the pan and then set it for another 7 minutes.
Turn on the light in the oven. Here you go. So, and then he'll baste those, and then anyone that lives near us can come do a drive-by. We'll put a few baggies of biscuits out, and maybe we can give you all some biscuits.
Yeah, because we're going to have about 24 biscuits here that we don't need to eat.
So who else has questions? Who made biscuits? I want to see Margaret's biscuits.
I hit the pause button because I didn't know that I had to refrigerate or freeze the Crisco, so that went into my freezer. So I'll upload some photos here in a little bit. But
okay.
But I can give testimony to Jack and Karen's breakfast. I've had my photographer stayed there one time, and I was invited to breakfast. I've had clients stay there too, of course, but sent my photographer there and joined him for breakfast. It was phenomenal. So thank you guys.
Well, we hope someday to be back into business. We miss our guests.
What else do you prepare for breakfast?
Oh, everything.
Wait, Jack has one more
tip. I want to say something. Remember, I was talking about that air cell baking sheet. Look at the bottom of this biscuit. It's done just the same amount as the top and the sides. Whereas if you use just a plain flat metal baking sheet, the bottom is going to be burned.
Okay.
So we make different kinds of French toast, and we make waffles and orange ricotta pancakes, and we make frittatas and breakfast enchiladas and sausage gravy.
Homemade cinnamon rolls.
Homemade cinnamon rolls. Let me think. What else? Oh, pecan encrusted bacon. That's our signature dish. And here, I'll show you the breakfast room where nobody's sitting right now.
I would love to see another tutorial on cinnamon rolls.
Well, someone was asking for that yesterday too. They're called Easy-Peasy cinnamon rolls. They're not all that easy, but they are delish.
That's another one that I've never made because of like the rising time and the kneading and everything that's involved with proofing and whatnot. I've just
these don't have to rise, so we can maybe do those another time.
Oh yeah, okay,
So,
that sounds good.
Who's gonna roll by and get a baggie of biscuits so I know how many put out on the sidewalk? Everybody lives too far away.
Adam, you're in Rocky Mount. Have you been up to the lake? Are you doing any virtual showings?
No, I've been to Westlake a few times, but it's a good hour at least to drive to Jack.
Yeah.
Unless you're pulling out the good scotch.
It's only what time is it?
It's okay. I couldn't get there till happy hour anyway. I do have two kids that might fit in your little flour or biscuit hole there to eat all the scraps from you.
Well, it is kind of a nice thing. It actually goes underneath, and just all we have is a cookie sheet down there. It's just so simple. We're kind of simple people, simple kind of arrangement.
That's a great idea. Speaking of kids, mine are just waking up, so y'all have a great day. I got to go take care of them.
Thanks for joining us.
Right. See you next one. Bye.
Bye.
So we'll, just by the way, Leslie hasn't asked any questions. I think she's typed out a few. And then, like I said, Karen and JP were joined in. But we'll clip this down and make this a little video like the book reading one so that people can see that online as well. I think this one will be phenomenal, I think. You guys did a fantastic job. I was going to ask if you had some biscuits already prepared, and you naturally did not disappoint.
They were very prepared.
These are still almost done in the oven. How much we got? Like 2 minutes left on them. So I was glad to see Leslie joined. She's actually a friend of ours who's been wanting to learn how to make biscuits from Jack, and so I can't see the chat. I don't know if there's any questions in there. Any more questions? Otherwise, we're about done here.
Let's see. No specific questions.
Thank you very much, guys. That was very informative. Look forward to trying to make those.
Yeah.
Oh, let us know how they turn out.
Yeah.
So all of my ingredients are just about done. So, and I have one of these, but no no antique cookie cutters, or not cookie cutters, but biscuit cutters.
Yeah.
But I'll work it out.
That's
So
good.
I'll upload photos of mine here in a minute.
Margaret, you can take a sharp knife and make square biscuits.
Okay.
Oh, look, yes. Heather's got the tips.
Just don't smear them.
Don't smear them, Jack says. That's all. That's his tip. He's got like
Yes.
5 tips he gave y'all.
Gotta be
Okay,
super sharp.
everybody. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing your pictures of your biscuits.
Come stay with us and eat breakfast here when coronavirus is done.
Yeah, it'll be awesome. So, all right. Well, thank you. And we'll just go ahead and end now.
Sure.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.